Richard Allen was familiar with the persuasive power of verse. Born into slavery in 1760, he purchased his freedom from a Delaware slaveholder in his early 20s after being converted to evangelical Christianity. Allen spent the next 5 years traveling the mid-Atlantic region as a Methodist itinerant minister alongside white clergy. During that time, he encountered a growing body of evangelical hymnody written by English and American poets and used these songs to add spiritual drama to his revival meetings. Allen collected and edited his favorites of these hymns and wrote his own, circulating them across the Atlantic seaboard through oral tradition and broadsides. It was in these contact zones of interracial camp meetings and an emerging Black print culture that some of the most enduring revival hymns of the 19th century came into being. This presentation investigates the multiple contact zones encapsulated within Richard Allen's 1801, A Collection of Spiritual Songs and Hymns, the first hymnal published by an African American in the United States. In 1993, Mary Louise Pratt theorized contact zones as, quote, social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, end quote. I use Pratt's definition as a point of departure, expanding on it throughout this presentation to include not only physical spaces, but also material texts and a form of spectral contact that persists in the archive. The hymns that Richard Allen wrote and edited were produced in the contact zone of mid-Atlantic revivalism, where enslaved and free Black Christians struggled against white supremacy and formed their own unique brand of American Protestantism. Furthermore, Allen's hymnal itself is a contact zone, a material text where the amalgamation of Black and white religious culture is preserved page after page. Examining this hymnal and other sources like it requires special attention to the multiple layered social spaces that they inhabit, which brings attention to the importance of Allen's work and ultimately resounds the silence of Black voices in the archive of early 19th century evangelical hymnody. The hymns that Allen collected and composed contained a theological hybridity that included influences from English Wesleyan hymns and African American religious customs. Many of these hymns were produced in the contact zone of the revival, a constantly shifting container for shared sentiment that allowed Black and white evangelicals the opportunity to exchange cultural worship practices. During his time traveling and preaching, Allen was introduced to a significant body of English and American clergy, predominantly white, who took interest in his ability to influence a crowd and shared many English hymn texts with him. The verses that Allen wrote and adapted demonstrate his efforts to bring Methodism to free and enslaved African Americans through a medium that he loved best, revivalism hymnody. One prominent example of the hymns that Allen developed out of the contact zone of revival is The Voice of Free Grace Cries, Escape to the Mountain. Given its place as the first hymn in his 1801 collection, this text was possibly one of Allen's favorites and well known by his congregation at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. Allen's adaptation was taken from a hymn appended to the autobiography of English Wesleyan Richard Birdsall, likely introduced to him during the 1784 Methodist General Conference in Baltimore. The original poem elaborates on the ascension of Christ, although Allen's version differed considerably. Christ, the voice of free grace, no longer escaped to the Mount of Olives in the story of the ascension, but rather cries escape to the mountain in the imperative voice. Given that many formerly enslaved Christians sang this hymn in Allen's congregation, escape as a commandment of Jesus likely carried powerful political connotations that reinforced the liberation theology that he preached. Another important textual alteration came in the refrain that Allen took from the third verse of Birdsall's version. In the original, Christ sealed a pardon for the sinner, whereas Allen's version acclaims the Lamb who purchased our pardon. Allen purchased his freedom nearly 20 years before the hymn was published, and the popular religious metaphor of salvation as a form of freedom is central in this text. He evidently liked the refrain so much that he used it a second time in his hymnal. The various influences from English and African Methodism highlight how many of Allen's hymns were produced in the contact zone of American revivalism. As such, these hymns represent what Mary Louise Pratt terms one of the, quote, literate arts of the contact zone, end quote. Expanding Pratt's term to include elements of material culture allows us to read and analyze Allen's hymnal as a contact zone in which several religious, national, and cultural perspectives converge in a single material text. Allen compiled texts by Calvinist and Arminian poets, representing an ecumenicalism that was more common in camp meetings than formal church services. English hymns, such as those published by the popular hymnist Isaac Watts, were included alongside American folk hymns. Allen's hymnal blurred racial lines too, with hymns that conveyed Black religious experience, traditional English texts, and even one hymn by Native American minister Samson Occam in the second edition. This collection was a social space, as all contact zones are, where the voices of poets, musicians, and clergy of various denominational affiliations and political interests converged on the page. One example that highlights the sociality of Allen's collection is an archival copy owned by white Methodist Ezekiel Cooper, who served as the book steward for the Philadelphia Methodist Church. Cooper marked up the voice of free grace with pen, editing what he deemed grammatical and theological errors in Allen's hymn. Cooper's script corrections met Allen's printed text on the page, grappling with each other over poetic authority. Allen's hymnal serves as a meeting place, a contact zone preserved on the page, for many diverse religious cultures and musical genres. It connected English classical hymnody to the spiritual, and even foreshadowed the development of American gospel hymnody later in the century. In doing so, this collection defined early African-American Protestantism while promoting a musical style that resonated in various sacred and secular American musical forms. Thus, examining adaptation of Allen's hymns in archival sources such as evangelical hymnals and broadsides highlights the spectral function of race in musicology. Jacques Derrida's method of hauntology is useful in locating the many forces that helped form 19th century revivalism hymnody and how this genre has evolved over time. The screams of Aunt Hester, dancing of Jim Crow, silence of Venus, the unattainable and highly illuminating animated properties belonging once to the voices of millions of enslaved African Americans. All of these, and still more, haunt American sacred music. Their dampened legacies intertwined with the weighted domination of colonialism, capitalism, and slavery. These ghosts demand to be heard in their eerie silences, their vague tonal apparitions. Listening to these musical traces and analyzing their subjectivity will provide a clearer picture of how interracialism shaped American evangelical hymnody throughout the 19th century. Archival sources, such as Richard Allen's hymnal, functions as spectral contact zones. Giving attention to the voices within them ultimately brings awareness to some of the neglected marks of history.